Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for this invitation to the APEC Senior Disaster Management Officials Forum. I'm very sorry I can't be with you personally today, but I hope the presentation we're going to make remotely it makes a useful contribution to the meeting. I'm going to present to you some of the results from the 2015 United Nations Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, which will give you some insights into what the new normal of risk will be in the Asia-Pacific region in the years to come. This report, which we call the GAR, is produced every 2 years by the United Nations and actually launched by the Secretary General. 2015 for us is actually a very special year. On the one hand, we've already had now 25 years of international commitment to disaster risk reduction since 1989. And this year in March, the new Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction was approved in Japan, which gives us a framework through to 2030. But this year is important for other reasons as well. We have the approval of the new Sustainable Development Goals, which will replace the old Millennium Development Goals later in the year. And also in December, we're really hoping for a concrete agreement on climate change at the COP21 in Paris. So for all these reasons, GAR 15 really looks at whether the whole approach we've been using to manage disaster risk up to now is effective or not, and what kind of approach we should be looking towards using over the next 15 years in the context of the Sendai framework. Many of you who are senior disaster management officials will be very familiar with these kind of diagrams. This is the famous disaster management cycle. On the left, you can see a diagram from around 1975, that's 40 years ago. And on the right, one of many more recent versions which are around. What happened is that since the 1970s, many of the emergency management organizations realized that instead of just responding to disasters, it was really more effective to do a whole circle or cycle of activities around managing disasters, including preparedness, mitigation, prevention, reconstruction. And this has really guided our work to how we've, let's say, dealt with disasters over the last 40 years. We look at disasters as events, and we do things before, during, and after the event. But the problem is we've had rather less good progress in actually managing the risks that lead to disasters in the first place. Every 2 years, the United Nations asks our member states, governments, to prepare a self-assessment on the progress they've been making in disaster risk reduction. The top two graphs refer to progress in actually disaster management, in preparedness, contingency plans, training drills, and having the capacities to do so. And most governments actually report they have better than average capacities in disaster management across all regions and income groups. But when we ask them about managing risks, bottom left in urban environments, bottom right in terms of major development projects, governments themselves are telling us they're actually not doing very well in managing the underlying risks which cause disasters in the first place. And as a consequence of that, over the last 25 or 30 years, the world has accumulated a large stock of risk which is waiting to manifest in new disasters. In this report, we actually measure this in terms of a concept called life years lost, which enables us to get over the fact that neither mortality, people killed, or dollars lost really reflects the full impact of disasters. Since 1980, according to global disaster statistics, we've been losing an average of 42 million life years lost a year. Very similar to the amount being lost globally through major infectious diseases and only slightly less than what's been losing from traffic accidents. APEC has, around half of this total life years lost, so very significant. But apart from looking at the past, I think this meeting, the whole focus of the meeting is really looking at the future, what could be a new normal, what is the world we're going to be in the future. The United Nations, through this GAR report, has developed, with a range of scientific partners, a global multi-hazard probabilistic risk model, which I think for the first time can give us an idea of the sort of figures we're going to be losing in the future. We use a metric that's called average annual loss, which is not your historic loss, it's your future loss, but also not necessarily what you will lose next year, because sometimes major disasters only happen every 20 or 50 years. So it's looking at all the future losses you may have and annualizing them. Think of this in many ways as the amount of money you should, in a sense, be setting aside each year to cover yourself against future disaster losses. Globally, and just in the built environment, and just in the face of some hazards, earthquake, flood, cyclone, wind, and storm surge and tsunami, globally, the AAL is around 314 billion US dollars. And APEC, I mean, why this subject is so important for you, you actually have 63% of this global AAL and around 58% of the global exposure. So roughly half of the risk in the world is in APEC countries. But the risk we also need to read through a range of other kind of lenses, because risk in a sense is just a kind of a raw, brute metric. So we also ask in the report what countries would actually have the financial resources, the public finances, to be able to absorb and recover from a large disaster. This map shows countries which would have a financing gap in the case of a 1 in 100 year loss event. So these are countries that once they've exhausted their available resources would have a gap of different sizes and therefore would have difficulty in recovering from the event. It's quite different from the previous map because, as you can see, most of the countries here are countries which are in the low and medium income bracket, including a number of APEC member countries. But beyond our capacity to absorb disasters, the risk also means it affects our capacity to develop. Because if we really were setting aside the resources every year to cover future disaster losses, these are resources we cannot be spending on capital investment, the infrastructure we need, on social expenditure, and on other important development goals. The right-hand columns of this graph in red show what the annual average loss represents as a percentage of what countries are currently spending on capital investment. And in many countries, you can see it represents a very significant proportion. Philippines, for example, is number 5 in this on the world. This excludes the small island developing states. So there's many low-income countries, middle-income countries, and even a high-income country, which is Greece. Not particularly because the risk is so high, but because capital investment has really dropped through the floor. So this is a problem for countries obviously with risks, but also countries which have got sluggish or non-existent capital investment at the present time. In the case of small islands, this also represents really an existential threat. These graphs show the relationship between risk and social expenditure, capital investment and capital stock across a range of small island developing states. The difference between the SIDS and the large countries is that in SIDS, disasters can often affect 100% of the population, 100% of the territory, and 100% of the economy. So that means that we're talking about, ratios here which are abnormally high. So for these countries, really, any future development prospect really involves seriously addressing disaster risk and climate change, because these are existential threats to the economies and societies of these countries. Climate change, as we know, will magnify this risk. And now that we actually have probabilistic risk metrics for every country in the world, which tells us the risk now, we can now actually start to identify what is the likely additionality of climate change. This is one of a number of exercises we did in the report to explore this. This, again, is countries in the Caribbean basin, and we looked just at what would happen with the likely increase in wind to 2050, assuming that exposure stays the same, vulnerability stays the same, and we didn't look at sea level rise or storm surge. So just with wind, in these small economies, we're talking about around a $1.4 billion increase in annual average loss by 2050. But if you look at the graph carefully, you'll see that in some countries, the risk goes up a lot. In some countries, it goes up a little. And at least in one country, in Mexico, it even seems to go down. So the effects of climate change are not going to be evenly spread. Some will lose more, some will even win. one of the characteristics of these global assessment reports has always been a focus on what we call extensive risk. This is the risk associated with extremely localized hazards and small and medium scale disasters, the kind of risks that come from small landslides, flash floods, fires, lightning strikes, etc. But we've crossed this data with a look at what is really the impact on local infrastructure. And one thing that comes out very, very clearly here is that most of the impact on local infrastructure, so on roads, water supply, sanitation systems, power and energy, health and education, most of the impact actually comes from extensive risk, from small and medium scale disasters. So it's extremely important that while we need to focus on the possible impact of 1 in 100, 1 in 500 year events, at the local level, our resilience is really being eroded through these smaller scale events. And these are the events which are actually the easiest to deal with through disaster risk reduction. So I think a very important conclusion for your countries. The report then goes on to look at 4 or 5 of the factors which are likely to change our risk profile over the next 30 or 40 years. So if we're talking about the new normal, these are all things we should be actually thinking about. The first one is that risk is often mispriced, both in public and private investment. These 2 maps show Miami Beach before and after the likely impact of sea level rise by 2060. In the right-hand map, you can see that by 2060, large areas of Miami Beach will actually be underwater. But this hasn't deterred major real estate investments in the area, which are continuing to this day. So this is telling us that really the risk isn't properly being priced into those investment decisions. And if we're not pricing the risk into the either public or private investment decisions, what will happen is we're going to get more and more assets built in hazard-exposed areas. And more assets in hazard-exposed areas is more and more risk. So it's something we really have to address. A second driver we've looked at is urbanization. In the USA, North America, Latin America, Europe, in a number of regions, these are highly urbanized regions, and we'll see just slow increases in urban development over the next few decades. But in Africa and in Asia, we will really see a major increase in urban development, starting off from a fairly low baseline between now and 2050. And a lot of this development will actually happen not in megacities, but actually in rapidly growing small and medium urban settlements. Unfortunately, many of these small and medium urban settlements are cities which neither have the capacities to plan and manage their urban development well per se, and even less to actually ensure that disaster risk is factored into these urban development plans. So quite a strong possibility that in rapid urbanization will lead to increases in risk over the next 20 to 30 years. Inequality is another driver we've looked at. You can read about inequality in reports from Credit Suisse and many other investment banks, which are telling us that globally we're nearing actually almost absolute inequality if you measure it on the Gini, using the Gini indicator. We've looked at inequality through a little bit of a different lens, which is looking at annual local government expenditure per person. So this is the amount that a local government can spend per year on its citizens in different countries. And why is this important? This is important because a lot of disaster risk reduction actually has to happen at the local level. I think we all know that. But if it can happen at the local level, it's going to be very dependent on the capacity of our local governments to make it happen. Now, if I live in Denmark, my local governments are spending an average of $12,000 per person per year on their citizens. If I live in some of the poorer sub-Saharan African countries, that actually goes down to $4. So we're talking about a range from $12,000 to $4. And this means that really, again, unless we can address in some way inequality and ensure that poorly resourced local governments actually have the resources necessary to be able to manage their risks, this in turn is going to become another risk driver, as it already is. Last but not least, we've looked at climate change and the degradation of the environment, whether this is the marine environment, forest lands, pasture lands, and so on and so forth. And the way we can look at this is actually by comparing what we're consuming as a planet and as a planetary society with the capacity of the planet to provide those resources and to absorb the waste principally being greenhouse gases. According to the statistics that are available, somewhere around the late 1960s, the capacity of the planet, its biocapacity, actually moved into negative territory compared to consumption. And if we compare consumption to biocapacity now, we would need around 1.5 planets to sustain our current levels of consumption. And I think, as most of you sitting in this meeting know, we currently only have one planet at our disposal. So this means we really have to seriously look at our consumption levels, because all these things, whether it's climate change and the different elements of environmental degradation, are directly linked to hazard, occurrence, severance, and therefore risk. Fortunately, sustainable development does seem to be possible. It was conventionally assumed that improving human development and social welfare was fundamentally dependent on consuming more and more energy. And it was generally assumed there's a linear relationship. The more energy we consume, the more we develop. But if you actually examine carefully, for example, the relationship between the Human Development Index, which is one of, I think, the best known indexes of social welfare and human development, with energy consumption per capita, you can see that the relationship is anything but linear. It's actually a non-linear relationship. For very poor countries, even small increases in energy consumption can lead to huge leaps in human development. So these are countries which actually need to consume more energy to actually get to a decent level of welfare and development. But beyond a certain point, the curve changes. And even major increases in energy consumption do not lead to commensurate increases in human development. So this, in fact, tells us that it is possible to achieve decent, high levels of human development and social welfare with relatively low levels of energy consumption. So it tells us that it is possible to actually address these risk drivers, and it is possible to achieve sustainable development. But this means we also then, coming back to our own subject, we really need to change the way we're conceptualizing and looking at disaster risk reduction. It's clear that our focus on disaster management over the last 25 years has led to reductions in mortality in some areas. We're far better at managing disasters. But the trouble is, if we're actually generating new risks faster than we're actually reducing them, the risk will continue to go up. So we need to have a focus now which goes beyond managing disasters and really looks at managing risks. Fortunately, this is really at the heart of the new Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. In the goal of the Sendai framework, it describes preventing and avoiding new risk, which some people call prospective disaster risk management. It talks about reducing some of our more critical existing risks, what some people call the corrective disaster risk management, and it also calls for strengthening social and economic resilience. Unlike the disaster management cycle, these things need to be happening at the same time, and countries need to find the right mix, the appropriate mix of strategies, which gives them, in a sense, most bang for a buck in terms of what they can actually invest in disaster risk management. And at the center of this graph, we don't actually have disasters, we have sustainable development. Because the whole focus on risk management isn't about managing events. It's about ensuring that disaster risk is really factored into the DNA of sustainable development and climate change adaptation. If we're going to deal with a new normal in the APEC region, this is going to be the way we will have to go. Thank you very much. We'll stop here. Thank you for your patience, and again, apologies that I couldn't be with you in person today.